This is Sam Lichtenstein, and this is episode 72 of the Unseen Podcast. I'm joined tonight by Paul Carr.
Hello.
Adam Smith.
Hi.
And we're excited today to have a special guest, Morgan Irons, Chief Scientist at Deep Space Ecology. So Morgan, our audience is all too familiar with Paul and Adam, so why don't you take a moment to introduce yourself?
Okay, great. Well, I am Morgan Irons, and I am currently a senior undergraduate at Duke University. I'm actually graduating within the next 3 weeks, so very soon I'll be an undergraduate.
Congratulations prematurely.
Thank you. Yeah, so my research is in the development of closed ecological systems for space habitation, and I've been doing this research for the past 2 years. So it's pretty much me connecting my passions for environmental science and ecology with space exploration. So I've been doing that for 2 years now, and I actually was defending my thesis today. So got that off my plate. All good.
How did it go?
It went well. It was one of my first real exposures to harsh critique, which you have to expect in the science world. You can't have positive reviews about everything. You have to be critiqued, and that through critiquing your science and other people's science, you can improve upon it. The critiques that I got are helping me improve my thesis as I finish it up this weekend, writing it up.
That's great.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's a little bit about me. Outside of the space field and helping run the business Deep Space Ecology, I love hiking and being outdoors, which makes sense, I guess. And I love planting trees. I help a lot with community service when it comes to environmental stewardship and stuff like that, and getting people involved with getting outside and getting their hands dirty when it comes to being involved in helping improve the environment. So yeah, there we go.
So I'm curious, are you planning to go to grad school next year?
So I'm taking a gap year, and then I'm going to be going into a PhD program. So I'll be applying for PhD programs this fall. And I'm looking at agroecology departments and working with a professor in an agroecology lab.
Okay, and I, as an ecology layman, I guess I don't know the difference between the different types of ecology, but so by way of background, I should say I found out about you and Deep Space Ecology from your interview on the We Martians podcast. And last episode 71, we had your father, Lee Irons, on to talk a little bit about the kind of the economic philosophy and the approach that your company is taking towards trying to come up with a sustainable business model to get these self-contained ecosystems from Martian colonization off the ground. Today, I thought we might focus more on the ecology and scientific aspects of the work. So maybe a good place to start would be kind of a Ecology 101, how you got excited about it, and maybe on a personal level, whether your interest in space motivated your interest in ecology or the other way around, or whether there's kind of a confluence of interest.
Okay, so the way I got interested in this, I've always been interested in space exploration and the environmental sciences and biology ever since I was little. So this has always been with me. Ask anyone. It's kind of obvious I was going to go into the environmental science kind of things. And so I came to Duke, and at first I was looking at the physics side of things. So I was looking into biophysics at first. And then I realized that wasn't really where my passion was. And so in my sophomore year, I was kind of trying to figure out where I wanted my life to go if it wasn't going to be using biophysics. And so I sat down and I had to be honest with myself. I'm like, I love environmental science and I love space exploration. How can I combine those two together? Because usually when you think about space exploration, you think of engineering, heavy STEM fields. And I had also done an internship back in high school at NASA Langley Research Center, working with them on developing chemical detectors for spacecraft. And so I had that kind of background with things. And so I was looking up on the internet research that had been done connecting environmental science with space exploration. And I found research that had been done in Soviet Union, Russia during the 1960s, and it was called the BIOS experiments. And that was my first look into closed ecological systems for space habitation. And it really intrigued me. So I decided to pursue it in an independent study during the spring semester of my sophomore year. And from there, I developed it into an experiment that I did all last year, and then into the thesis I'm currently doing. And based off this research is how I also helped found the company Deep Space Ecology.
Cool. So I don't know anything about the BIOS program. Is there like a brief backgrounder that you can give on kind of what the state of the art was, or has how the field has developed over the past few decades?
Sure. So Soviet Union, Russia has always been ahead of us when it comes to space exploration. I've come to realize, particularly when it comes to the habitation side of things. I was really impressed when I was reading their BIOS experiments, which consisted of 3 different experiments. So you had BIOS 1, BIOS 2, and BIOS 3. BIOS 3 being the main experiment that brought everything together. And they were pretty much looking at building the system from technology-based to human biology technology into a fully integrated system, and looking at different levels of plants that could be used. So using, let's see, if I'm remembering correctly, it was starting off with algae and then using higher level plants that you could actually use for food as well. And so they were looking at developing the system. It was very technology based, and they eventually introduced a human crew into the system, and they kept the system closed for a pretty long while before opening it back up. So they did a really good job, and I was very impressed with what they had done. And then we moved on from there. Let me pull this up quickly for my reference. I actually made this huge, just like timeline of closed ecological system research. So let me pull that up so I can go into a bit more detail. So let's see. Yeah, so the BIOS experiments were taking place 1964 going into 1971. So with the BIOS 1, BIOS 2, and BIOS 3. And it wasn't until, I believe, the 1970s, 1978, that NASA kind of caught up and decided to initiate their Controlled Ecological Life Support Systems program. So a little bit late coming to the game when it came to actually integrating biology and bioregenerative systems into space habitation modules. So we had that. And then moving forward, you had the Biosphere 2 experiments, which is very famous. Biosphere 2 is currently owned by the University of Arizona. And what they're really famous for is integrating 7 different biomes, which are entire kinds of ecosystems like steppes, desert, tropical rainforest, that kind of thing, into a structure. So I liked the idea of what they were doing, but as an ecologist, I was horrified. I was horrified that they would just put 7 different biomes into one space without really a buffering system between all of them. It was horrifying. But the reason why I liked what they were doing was that was the first time that the idea of actually putting an entire ecological system into a habitation module came out into the open.
So how did that contrast with what the BIOS project was doing?
So the BIOS experiment was more technology based. You pretty much had bioreactors instead of planting in a field-based system.
Does that mean something like a tub of algae that's designed to process CO2 into oxygen? That sort
exactly.
of.
Mm-hmm. Yep. While the biosphere experiment was old-time agricultural techniques, and then just having those entire biomes in there. And so there was all of that. And then you had other programs like the Lunar Mars Life Support Test Project that NASA ran. You also have the Melissa project run by over in Europe. You also have the initiation of NASA's in situ resource utilization analog missions, things like that. And then you have other models that are out there that aren't necessarily closed ecological system models. So you have human-based models where you would bring in food into the environment, such as the High Seas experiment, MDRS, the Aquarius reef base, things like that, where you would require shipment of food into them. And then you have human technology models, the International Space Station being one of those, where it's really highly technology based to help support human life. You're kind of using technology to replace the ecological and environmental processes that you would have on Earth. And that's like environmental control and life support systems. And
so is it fair to say there's been kind of 2 parallel tracks, the ones that are more designed for spacecraft life support that tend to be more technology based, and those are kind of developing in parallel with these more ecological systems that are maybe more oriented towards colonization type situations? Mm-hmm. Or is that a too simplistic way of thinking about it?
I think that's a pretty good way of looking at it. You definitely have to look at what your major uses will be. What's the main goal of the system that you're building? Is it just to transport you from one place to another? Are you actually going to live in the system for a couple months versus years? Is it just going to be for research, just like the International Space Station? And with the International Space Station, it's right here next to Earth in low Earth orbit. So you can easily evacuate if an emergency comes up. You can get pretty quick resupplies of things that you need. So that's a very low risk situation, I would say. When you talk about high risk situations, that's when you're talking about like Mars or the moon, where it's a little bit more difficult to evacuate and to get the things that you need. So with those more high risk systems, you definitely want to have more integration of bioregenerative technology, where you're not relying on having to constantly replace worn down parts to keep systems running. You actually have biology in place that's self-healing, that can regenerate and keep going.
Okay, so bioregenerative means that you have essentially a self-sustaining ecology where you are. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I'm an engineer, so I don't know anything about biology. we kind of don't like biology in engineering. It's always getting in our way. So Mars is probably your perfect platform, right? I mean, it's very difficult to get supplies to Mars. It's very difficult to get food to Mars in particular. So whoever gets to Mars and wants to live there for more than a few months has to grow potatoes, right? or well, actually, that's one of my questions. Is let's get into details here. When you get to Mars, uh, what's the current thinking on what we should eat at Mars and how we can grow food there?
Okay. So I would definitely say when it comes to developing closed ecological systems, you want to start before the human crew gets there.
Ah,
Um, you don't want to go there and start planting and not have anything to eat for a while, especially if you realize that, oh, nothing actually grew. Nothing's actually growing. The tests that we ran on Earth are completely cut off from what we're doing up here in space now. So you want to definitely have that initial setup where you have rovers and other technology go up there, start building the system like the habitation modules and things like that. And then possibly design a system where it could allow initial planting and initial tree treatments, which are pretty much the biological things that are necessary for plants to grow, such as putting nutrients into the soil using biosolids or another kind of fertilizer, putting pioneer species into the soil. And I would describe it as pretty much you're initiating ecological succession, and ecological succession is the process an ecosystem goes to get to what we see today outside. These systems have been developing for hundreds of years to get into these climax communities where they're sustainable, they're stable, and they're resilient. So if a disruption happens, they can go back to an equilibrium stable point. And so that's what you want to do. You want to be able to start creating a stable system instead of starting off with climax communities like what we see outside, which is what Biosphere 2 was doing, and go up there and suddenly everything fails because the system's so unstable, because it wasn't allowed to develop the biological processes like nutrient cycling in the soil or establishing a microbial community that can survive and be able to interact with the plants that you're introducing. Things like that. So I would say start doing things before you actually bring a human crew up there. In regards to what kind of plants we're looking at, one of my big things that I believe in is choosing plants that are not only for food, but also have multifunctionality. So they're not only used for food, but maybe you can use this certain plant as a medicinal herb to help with an illness. For example, French sorrel can be used as a kind of lettuce salad food, but then you can also use it as a medicinal herb to treat upper respiratory infections. So in that way, you actually have a way to use this plant in multiple ways. And so that's one of the things that we really have to look into, so that we can use the space and the resources to our full advantage. And also, you want to choose plants that are going to be highly nutritious for humans and meet that nutrition baseline and the number of calories that you need for a person in a day. Because, of course, we want to make sure that the people there are healthy and doing well. And then you're also looking at plants that provide services to the actual ecological system there. You want plants that are help interacting with the microbes in the soil to make nutrients bioavailable so that plants are able to uptake them so that those plants do better and so that you can use those plants as food for other purposes. And so there's a lot of things you have to look into when choosing plants to go up there. And you did mention potatoes. people always mention potatoes when we talk about this subject. I would say.
I wonder why.
I know. I wonder why. I would say that my choice of potatoes that I would want to grow up on Mars are purple Peruvian potatoes that are grown in the Andes. And the reason why I'm saying that is that these potatoes can grow really large and they're used to a degraded, harsh environment, which is what you're going to find up on Mars. And so one of the other things that I look into with my research is just the biodiversity of the plants that we could be introducing up there. We shouldn't just focus on your typical Western style plants like wheat and corn and yellow potato, golden potatoes, things like that, which are important, of course. They provide a lot of nutritional value, but there are so many different species out across the world that could do better and could provide the same nutritional value. We just have to set the criteria for the kinds of plants that we're looking for and then go out to these different places and find these different species of plants that could do much better than ones that we're currently thinking about.
So
when you say soil, you're talking about Martian regolith.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So
yeah.
I presume that you have to treat it in some way before you can get plants to grow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say so.
Kind of things would you have to do?
Yep. So
you need Matt Damon's poop, right?
Oh, everybody has that,
well,
right?
actually, that's where some of my thesis research was what kind of pre-treatments could we add to the Martian regolith to prepare it for plant growth. And some of those things were using a biosolid application, which is poop, to create a natural fertilizer. The only thing you have to be careful about when it comes to using biosolids is all the extra stuff in it, because you're not only getting the nutrients from it, but you may also be getting some metals in it. You may be getting some hormones if one of the women on your crew is taking a hormone pill. So there are things like this that you have to look out for. So I don't know if we might be able to develop this, but biosolids that are used for agricultural purposes are called biosolids type A. And so they go through a little bit more processing before they're put out onto a field. So maybe you could collect these biosolids throughout your trip and then put them through a similar treatment process before using them as a fertilizer. So there's that. You definitely also want to introduce microbes into your system. We currently do not know if there are microbes on the surface of Mars and in the regolith. So that little discovery, if there is something to discover in that regard, could either lead to us not being able to establish a closed ecological system up there due to cross-contamination that goes into space law. But if there are no microbes up there, we're fine. But I think it would be cool if there was. But anyway, that's the ecologist side thing.
Well, yeah, you can't lose, right? If there's microbes, it's great. If there aren't, it's great, right?
Yeah, I know. Either way.
But so you do your research using a simulant regolith, is that correct?
Yes, I do.
And so that presumably unavoidably contains certain microbe populations. Is that a challenge for knowing whether you have a good analog to the situation that you'd find on Mars?
Well, I completely sterilized the regolith before I used it, which makes what the research I'm doing kind of unique in that regard, because I'm starting with a completely degraded regolith simulant that has no microbes in it because I sterilized it. And with my experiment, I also looked at whether plants would grow in a bone dry condition, which is what you would find up on Mars, or if adding water to the regolith before planting had an effect. So that's another pre-treatment to think about, because this regolith that you're about to introduce plants to is very compact just because of how small the particles are. We're talking about sand and dust particles, so very small. And they're very easy to compact. And since you don't have any water in the system, none of them are really going to clump together that well. So once you first introduce water into the system, it's going to turn into cement. I had to deal with that with this simulant, and I had to pretty much learn how to avoid that and kind of use it to my advantage, actually. So what I did to solve that problem was to add water into the system and let it dry so that it creates that crust, that cementing that's occurring. And then I tilled into it and broke it all up. And what's important about that process is that you're taking these small particles of sand and dust and making them clump together into bigger pieces. And the reason why this is so important is because now you don't have as much compaction, and that allows more air movement in the regolith, allows more water movement, and it will allow the root systems of your plants to spread out more. So that's also something to look into, whether we have to add an initial water and tilling treatment to the regolith before we start planting anything.
I'm curious, are there places on Earth, maybe desert ecosystems, where people do agriculture under similar soil conditions? Or is it pretty unique to this Martian type soil?
No, there are a pretty good amount of places that do this. Like, we're talking about places in the Middle East, places out in Arizona and California, pretty much these places that have large stretches of desert and don't have as much rain. And you see people going out there and developing these systems to support agriculture. It requires a lot of water and a lot of irrigation, but they're doing it. And that's a pretty good analog to look at when trying to determine how we can treat the regolith as well. The only difference between what they're doing out in the deserts here on Earth and what we would be doing is there are going to be some microbes in the soil. There's going to be some form of organic matter there as well, and there might be a little bit more nutrients, especially bioavailable nutrients. While with the regolith on Mars, there's most likely no microbes. There's going to be no organic matter. And even though there are nutrients there that can support plant life, a lot of them are not bioavailable. They're in chemical forms that plants cannot take up, which is why you would need the microbes to be introduced into the system, because microbes work to change these chemicals into a form that plants can take up. And these microorganisms can include rhizobium bacteria, which is pretty much the big group of bacteria that fixes nitrogen into a form that plants can take up. And then you have mycorrhizal fungi, and mycorrhizal fungi pretty much interacts with the plant roots as well, and helps the plants take up nutrients and take up water. And these microorganisms live in symbiosis with the plants, and they both support and help each other. So there's a lot of stuff to consider when it comes to how we could develop the regolith to support plant life.
So I'm still a little confused. I'm easily confused, but the question I have is, Martian soil, my understanding of it has a lot of pretty damaging organic compounds in it, like perchlorates.
Mm-hmm.
Do we have to treat it for that first, or I mean, do we really understand Martian soil very well yet? That's another question, I guess.
I think we need to do more research and analyze the soil more. I mean, we haven't even analyzed it for biological things yet. I think one of the most recent rovers that's gonna go up, it has a biological component to it. I'm blanking on what it's called though.
Mars 2020 is all they're calling it right now, right? Yeah.
Yes, yeah, that's what it was. So we haven't even done that yet. So I would say before we attempt to eat anything off from the regolith, we definitely need to do more research. Unless someone wants to be a guinea pig, I wouldn't recommend it.
Hey, I'm old. I don't mind. I've lived a good full life.
So a sample return mission would be quite useful from your perspective.
Oh yes,
Yeah.
that would be wonderful.
And that's been a dream for 2 decades at least.
Mhm.
Now, Red Dragon is landing. Well, they're planning to land in a few years. The next Red Dragon may actually be a sample return after that. So
that would be amazing.
you might have to go work for Elon to get any access to that. But
I know, seriously. Yeah. I have a friend who's going to be interning at SpaceX this summer, so maybe I have a way in.
I think he's going to be hiring a lot more people like you over the next few years. And not so many rocket. Well, still hire rocket scientists, but they're going to need to know something about Martian soil. It's very obvious that we're going to have that, and we got to get samples back. We can't just rely on instruments on the surface to do that.
Oh, I agree.
But speaking to Paul's specific question about perchlorates, or maybe more generally, are there maybe things that aren't necessarily simulated well with the simulant you've been able to work with that are potential concerns for your research?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the simulant that I'm using was recommended to me by 2 scientists that I been in communication with at Jet Propulsion Laboratory out in California. So they recommended I use the simulant, which is a simulant they commonly use. And so the restrictions that I have with this simulant is that it's not going to be fully characteristic of the Martian regolith. The Martian regolith is going to have the perchlorates, of course. They're going to have some heavy metals there as well. And when it comes to trying to remove heavy metals and perchlorates, it's a bit difficult because you can use microbes to make the metals not bioavailable, but you're not actually fully removing the metals from the environment, which might be what's going to happen with the perchlorates as well. So that's another thing. If we can get a sample from Mars and bring it down here, we could run tests on it to see if we could remove the perchlorates. That would be so valuable to research when it comes to growing things on the Martian surface. So that's something that I would love to look into, using different remediation techniques to see if we could improve the regolith chemically, remove these heavy metals or make them less bioavailable, and as well as the perchlorates.
Right now, in terms of now, obviously we're very Mars focused here, but I know you also have looked at how the same technology can be used on Earth.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, when we talked to your dad a couple weeks ago, we had this discussion of there's applications on Earth that can go to Mars. Can you explain that a little bit more in depth? I know you have some proprietary issues, but
yeah. So a sentence phrase that I commonly tell people when they ask about that is that the vision of deep space ecology is making food available in space by solving food security on Earth. Because a lot of the problems that we see here on Earth have to deal with trying to get food into remote locations, so that expensive and politically charged supply chain to get to groups of people who are in these isolated areas, as well as places where people live that can be considered extreme environments that are not really conducive of a sustainable agricultural base. Or you have problems dealing with climate change and other ecological disruption problems that are changing the environment in some way. You lose your historical food source. So those things are very similar to problems that we could see in space with the supply chain being in an extreme environment, and being able to create a unique ecology to that location. And so what my company is doing is looking at the agricultural industry and looking at food sustainability problems, such as food deserts in the inner city, or looking at food security problems in Somalia or in, the Arctic, these locations that are just hard to get to and have these extreme environments. And we're interested in looking at how we can solve these sustainability problems and create closed ecological system analogs here on Earth, to pretty much test how we could do it here on Earth and then spin it into space exploration. And it's very exciting. I especially want to be able to go into these areas and learn from the people, because that's the huge thing. You go into these areas and these people have been living with certain food crops for centuries. They know the knowledge of it, and being able to learn from them and see, oh, these crops would actually work very well in this kind of environment, and then integrating them into a system so that you can help sustain the agricultural base of that area. And that would also introduce us at Deep Space Ecology to different kinds of plants that we could also introduce into space, which would be really cool.
Do you think there might be some low-hanging fruit, like harsh environments, Somalia, for example, maybe the soil's not great. They have some agricultural tradition there. They grow certain crops that are maybe well adapted to the environment, but do you think that there might actually be modern scientific techniques that ecologists from other areas know about, soil pretreatment, things like that, that could actually make a big difference in relatively near future for improving the agricultural productivity of some of these regions?
Oh, definitely. I agree. When it comes to building these analogs in these areas, you're definitely going to be introducing technology and sustainability techniques so that the communities there can use this system to their benefit. So they don't have to rely on having to get food from outside their economy. So in a way, this actually bootstraps their economy, where they're able to keep the money in circulation in their local area. And this opens up possibilities for opening up businesses to support your agricultural base now that it's become more sustainable and more of a constant in that environment. And so there are definitely things we're looking at to be able, so that people can become self-sustaining and not have to rely on outside sources to support them.
Well, now you mentioned the Arctic. Now that's an environment where they have little or no agriculture, right? They mainly eat fish and other animal products. Now, that doesn't apply to Mars, I understand, because there are no animals there that we can eat. But is there anything we can learn from that, from the people that have survived there for thousands of years without agriculture?
I would say, yeah, sustainability techniques with living in such a harsh environment, what they do to survive. You're also looking at such a cold environment, which is what you're going to be finding on Mars. Mars is going to be more extreme, of course, but this could be a place where we could test out heat conservation, how we can build a system that could conserve heat and conserve energy with the change in temperature, with the extreme temperatures, as well as the change in day length as well. Particularly if you want to also build a system on the moon, because you have that 14-day length periods. So how would you deal with that as well? Well,
Right.
you can do an analog in the North Pole in that area to test things like that out.
Right, because they have darkness for many months at a time. So, yeah, good answer.
Has
I give you an A.
I constantly think of the stuff, so.
Has any of your research addressed including fish farming in closed system ecologies?
So I haven't done a lot of research on the animal side of things. I've done some research on the insect side of things. When it comes to animals, I know like the animal physiology of how they could react in such an environment. But I don't know. I would say that we should test fish on like the International Space Station or another analog before really seeing if it would be a viable option.
Moonfish.
I'm sure we could get it to work. I'm sure. And I think it would be very valuable, especially when you're talking about like aquaponics and hydroponic systems, because you may be having to rely on those kind of systems until you can really get your agricultural ecological side up and running.
Are your plant species going to need pollination through insects, or will they be pollinating themselves?
So the species that I used in my experiment are all self-pollinated or wind-pollinated, because I didn't know whether we would be introducing insects, at least in the first phase of development and human colonization on Mars. Maybe in future phases we would, but until we know for certain that we can put bees up there and they're not all going to die off, and then suddenly you're left with this ecological system that was built to rely on insects for pollination, and now there's no insects. You want to be safer than be sorry in the end.
Right.
So I would say probably your first phase should be focused on plants that are self-pollinating and wind-pollinated.
I'm very ignorant. Is that like if you look at the majority of food crops in the United States, for example, corn and soybeans and wheat, are these mostly self-pollinated or wind-pollinated, or are
a lot of them are wind-pollinated? I know the sorry, I've been talking all day. I hope I don't lose my voice. The golden peas that I was using in this experiment are self-pollinated. So they were able to produce the peas right off the back without needing wind or an insect to do it. So
other than pollination, are there other important ways that animals are essential to kind of agricultural ecosystems on Earth, I mean?
Yeah, so plants do provide that extra fertilizer aspect. They also can be used to carry seeds between different locations, which is how plants are able to spread into different areas. You have to be careful with introducing animals into an environment, though, because they can easily become pests and start eating up your agricultural plants, which you don't want. You also, if you introduce the animals, have to start supporting them as well, feeding them and giving them the resources that they need to survive. You also have to be careful for animals that are really heavy, because you don't want them walking into the system and compacting the soil down. So now you can't really grow anything there unless you dig everything back up and till it again. So there are different things that you have to look at when it comes to introducing animals into a system.
Right.
There's a lot of stuff that you have to think about.
It sounds like the deer that live around my house. You know, they're pests. They're cute, but they're pests.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and rabbits. Rabbits are so cute, and I would love to introduce rabbits, but they would eat everything.
Well, we have a lot of foxes around my house, so there's hardly any rabbits.
With wind-pollinated crops, would you need to purposefully introduce an air circulation system specifically for the pollination, or would it be the passive flow of air within an artificially enclosed ecosystem would be sufficient?
So I would say you would probably have to have a period of time where you increase the air circulation to be able to knock the pollen off of the plants. Sometimes people even like shake the plants to get it knocked off first. So I would say as your plants go through their maturation period until they reach harvest and until they start producing pollen, that when they reach that stage, you should have a period where you're just pushing wind through the system, simulating wind. It would also be good to help make sure that your atmosphere doesn't become stale, especially with the buildup of volatile organic compounds, VOCs, which is going to happen when you introduce plants and other organisms into a closed environment. So you're definitely going to want to have a air cleansing system as well.
Do we need a bigger volume for that reason, or you know, a big dome over our plants, or can we live in a fairly confined volume?
So it depends on how many crew members you're going to have in that system. So to be able to support a crew of 8 people, you're going to need a lot of space to grow enough plants to support them through a growing season until the next growing season. So it really depends on how many people you have in the crew.
What kind of order of magnitude are we talking in terms of acres per crew person?
I'm not remembering the number exactly.
I'm just curious about a ballpark estimate.
Yeah. I would say definitely bigger than a football field.
Per
for
person.
a crew of 8 people. For a crew of 8 people.
If in a successful Martian settlement, do you envision scaling up in terms of making a bigger enclosed structure, or making several enclosed structures that are related to each other, presumably by tunnels or something like that, or building vertically up, like the idea of vertical farms within urban areas?
Yeah, so we can definitely incorporate vertical farms. I would recommend it, because that way you can reduce down on space, at least width-wise, maybe not height-wise as much. But yeah, definitely incorporate vertical farming.
For the sake of efficiency.
Yeah, for the sake of efficiency.
So one big structure with a vertical farm inside would be preferable to a whole lot of domes stretching laterally outward.
Yeah. One thing that my company came up with, which I've talked about in talks before, so I can talk about it here, is building the ecological system section by section. So you don't build the entire structure at once. You build one facility, close it off, and then you build another facility, and then you can open up those two to each other, and thus you increase the floor space, and then you can build it in sections like that so that it's easier to handle. You don't have to build the entire thing.
Okay, now I know you can't solve every problem at once, but I'm going to use the R word here, radiation, right? How well did the kind of crops you're looking at handle the radiation environment on Mars?
So not a lot of research has been done when it comes to heavy radiation exposure. I think the main area has been Chernobyl and what the ecosystem is like there, because you have plants growing all around Chernobyl. So it's not like you introduce radiation and everything dies. There are going to be plants that survive in a high radiation environment. One of the things that I think we should do is expose these plants to a Martian environment in that regard, because you want to make a unique Martian ecology. You don't want to be fully reliant on keeping these plants hidden from everything, and then you have to rely on a lot of technology to sustain it. You have to rely on lighting systems, things like that, to be able to support your system. You want to try to allow your ecology to evolve to fit the environment that you're living in. And that way you become more sustainable in the long term and eventually become fully independent from Earth. So when we introduce these plants to Mars, a lot of them are likely to die, but there are going to be some that start to evolve into a unique Martian ecology. And those are the plants that you want to keep reintroducing into the system.
Now, here's something you should get involved in.
Yes.
The Red Mars scheduled for 2020. One of the things they're talking about is putting a small greenhouse out on the surface. What species of plant goes in that small greenhouse? I'm not sure it's been really even thought about yet. I have no insight into that, but. So you'd recommend that if we're going to do experiments, we should put a diversity of plants in a greenhouse and see what thrives and what doesn't, right? Or that's probably too simplistic, but what would you recommend?
So let me make sure I'm clear on this. It's introducing a small-scale greenhouse onto the surface of Mars with just a few plants in it?
It would not be a large greenhouse. It would be probably something that could fit inside a station wagon,
Okay.
a few feet by a few feet, let's say.
And would the system be using the regolith there?
No, it would probably have its own soil.
Okay. Yep, and it would be completely closed off with its own lighting source as well.
Well, the lighting would be the sun, I think. It's a greenhouse.
Okay. Okay.
It might be heated, I suppose. I guess.
I think it would be some kind of thermal control. They wouldn't let it go completely up to equilibrium with Mars, because nothing would grow at that temperature.
So what I would say is it depends on what the objective of the mission is. Are you sending it up there to see if things will actually grow under that radiation? Are you sending it up there to see how fast things will grow? Things like that. So when you're thinking about these things, you need to look at germination period, how long it's going to take these plants to actually sprout.
They might be germinating on the way to Mars, for all I know.
That would be.
Let's imagine that Elon Musk is listening to this podcast. And
of course he is. He listens to all of them.
You get to determine the mission objectives.
Yeah, so I would say trying to grow a plant going from Earth to Mars would be very difficult with the current technology and what we know when it comes to that, especially with it being in 0G.
That's something I wanted to ask about. Paul mentioned radiation. What about gravity, the low gravity of Mars? How big a factor will that be?
So the low gravity of Mars could affect the root system because the root systems here on Earth rely on gravity to help hold them down and direct them down into the soil. So when it comes to how plants could change in terms of physiology, on Mars, you could be seeing plants that have smaller root systems but longer stems. And you could also be seeing plants that have larger leaves to capture more sunlight from the sun, since you're not going to get as much sunlight or as strong of the energy coming from the sun. So there are different things that you could be seeing under the environment.
Do we understand the
Mars.
genetic?
And I would recommend.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I was just saying that I would recommend looking at genetically modified
That was my question.
plants.
Do we understand the genetics of plants well enough? And I know that in common agricultural plants, they know the genetics extremely well because there's so much money in that there's a lot of incentive to study it. But do we understand these genetics well enough to know how to modify them for Mars?
Only certain plants. We would need to do more research with the plants that we decide to bring to Mars. One of the labs that I worked with here at Duke during my time here was the Willis Lab. And they are one of, you will find mention of their lab in any biology book. They're actually really well known. And their research is in yellow monkey flowers. And these flowers, these plants live in serpentine soils, so very degraded soils, and yet they are able to survive and flourish, and they do very well. And so some of the stuff this lab does is look at the genetic markers in the genetic codes of these plants to see which gene is allowing these plants, which gene or couple of genes is allowing these plants to survive in this harsh environment. So that's what we would have to look at. We would have to look at what gene we would have to modify in these plants that would allow us to make it more drought tolerant, make it less susceptible to radiation and creating oxidant radicals in its physiology that could lead to damage in the tissues, things like that. So I'm completely open to doing genetic modification and doing more research in that regard with bringing plants into space.
Okay, now can you tell us a little bit about what I know you have some in a startup. There's always issues of disclosing too much or too little, but your father. I asked your father, could he give us the elevator speech for Deep Space Ecology, and he basically deflected that question because he says, "Look, unless you're a billionaire, I'm not going to give you that speech." But if somebody, a reporter sticks a microphone in your faces, what is Deep Space Ecology all about? What do you say?
I say that our focuses are on healthy living, food security, and human expansion. Healthy living when it comes to providing families with the ability to grow their own fresh and clean vegetables and fruits year-round. Food security to provide locations in the world and out in space that are plagued with drought and famine and poverty with the ability to grow clean fruits and vegetables year-round. And then in terms of human expansion, to provide closed ecological life support systems to support human expansion into the deep spaces of Earth, Mars, and beyond.
Wow, you've got it rehearsed well.
Oh, I've been talking a lot today with people who have been interested in my company. So
Yeah.
In the strong selection pressures you would experience in the first generation, you talked about creating a distinctively Martian ecosystem. How rapidly would you expect to see speciation in that kind of environment?
So you would see the fastest speciation in the microbial communities. So you would definitely have to keep your eye out on those because they're going to evolve very rapidly, and you don't want to introduce a microbe that could evolve into something that could become virulent or dangerous for humans or the plants. And then in regards to the plants, they could evolve like just little changes here and there, probably over the first couple of generations. You might not see anything after, like right after the first generation, but maybe the third generation you would start seeing little changes here and there, maybe like larger leaves, shorter stems, larger flowers, just little things like that.
Is there a way to make the differentiation between microbial community or species that could become virulent as opposed to those which are more likely to remain safe?
So a lot of research in that regard is being done on the International Space Station. So I would say we would need to continue to do more research on that because it is hard to say. Who knows what trigger in the environment could cause a change in the epigenetics of a microbe. So yeah, we need to do more research when it comes to exposing certain species of microorganisms to lower gravity or higher radiation levels.
Strongly selective effects.
In terms of the plant evolution, could you envision a scenario where even if the colony was supported by external food sources for 10, 15 years, they would kind of use that time to bootstrap the local ecosystem using kind of artificial selection techniques, like, choosing the seeds of the more successful plants and kind of trying to edge evolution along a little bit and get the Mars adapted species up and running faster?
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, we've been doing that here on Earth with animal husbandry, with plant husbandry, selecting the plants that would produce more yield, that would do better in certain environments. The current wheat species, I'm forgetting the name of it, but there's like the most common wheat species in the United States is actually genetically modified just by us selecting like different plants that were different species that were doing well and pollinating them together. So
is that einkorn wheat? Is that einkorn wheat?
I believe that's one of them, yes. The wheat species that I was using in my experiment here at Duke was Sonora wheat, which is considered one of the mother wheats, one of the original wheats. So I wanted to go back before all of the genetic modification and see how that species would do.
Is that an original from the Fertile Crescent?
I wouldn't go back that far. I would say in the US, it's probably as old as before Europeans came over.
Pre-Columbian in origin.
Yeah. Yep.
I'm just looking over the list of topics that we had thought about asking you beforehand, before we wrap up. One I was wondering was how you think about the possibility of xenobiological contamination, whether you worry about designing ecosystems that would be robust to Martian life if it exists, or whether you consider that possibility too far-fetched to worry about in advance.
Yeah, so that's something that I do think about with the international laws that were set by the United Nations, the planetary protection laws, where they talk about pretty much making sure we avoid any harmful contamination to these places that we explore. And I take that very seriously, just because I am like an ecologist and environmental scientist at heart. If we do end up finding microorganisms on Mars, we better have a habitation system, a closed ecological system that is pretty sealed. But I'm not as concerned in that regard either, because if a microbe escapes from the closed ecological system, the chances that that microbe will survive in the Martian environment is pretty low, because it just hasn't evolved in that kind of environment. So there's that. But yeah, we definitely have to make sure that we protect the natural ecology that's in these locations, especially if we want to study them and see if they're similar in genetics to what we have on Earth. That would help us look into origins of life questions for our solar system.
I guess I was also wondering about the other direction, though, because if you imagine that the local life forms are adapted to a relatively harsh environment, if they sneak into the closed ecological system, which is maybe richer in some regards, in terms of nutrients and things like that, whether they could suddenly become invasive and suddenly your colony's dead in a horrible alien versus predator type situation.
Oh yeah. That is a possibility. And that's the thing about biology. You can't really know 100% what could happen. And who knows, maybe we find these microorganisms, study them, find that they're not harmful to us. And maybe we could integrate those into the system and see if they survive. Because then you would be using in situ resources and bringing them into the environment. So genetic research would have to be done on any organisms that we find out on Mars, to see if there's similarities or differences in whether it would be harmful or helpful for our closed ecological system.
What would you see as the role or potential role of institutions like the Svalbard Seed Vault in terms of off-world agriculture and the ability to draw on a deep reservoir of biological seeds in order to experiment on places like the Moon and Mars and artificial habitats?
That would be wonderful. Just the thought of that is amazing. That would make our jobs very much easier.
Is your job made difficult by lack of access to resources?
Yeah, pretty much. If I want to test certain seeds, I have to go out and find somewhere where I can buy them. And then there are just species that I don't know about. Just maybe there's a species out there that does well in very low atmospheric pressure environments and just thrives, and you can eat it, that it's edible. And this isolated community out on top of this mountain knows about it, but I don't know about it, so I'm not able to learn more about it and possibly use it in my system. So being able to have the help of a organization that has been collecting these seeds and has gained a lot of this knowledge over time would be amazing.
So an international effort would definitely be helpful in terms of investigating rare or lesser known plant species.
Yeah, this should definitely be an international effort. I'm completely in support of that. Space exploration is a way to bring people together, which I encourage.
Would you go to Mars?
Would I go to Mars? If there was a return trip, I don't know if I could remain there the rest of my life, but I've I've been having my ultimate goal set with entering the astronaut program, whether that's private industry or ends up being with NASA, to possibly be the astroecologist that they send up there. I'm also thinking about whether I want to continue my education beyond my PhD and do an MD in space medicine. I finished going through the pre-medicine program here at Duke, so that avenue is open to me as well. Because I've always been interested in how humans and the environment interact as well, particularly when it comes to health-related things. So we'll see. Who knows?
Without any qualifications, you'd be a pretty valuable crew member.
Well, that's the thing. You don't only want plants that are multifunctional. You want crew members that are multifunctional.
Yeah, well,
So
like
we've been going,
Mae Jemison, who was a shuttle crew member, who also a doctor, and so yeah, that would be. I think that would be a slam dunk for you if you got all those credentials together.
Mm-hmm.
So we've been going a little more than an hour now, so I think maybe we'll start wrapping things up. We often end these with go around the panel and ask for final thoughts or a recommendation from anyone. If you don't have a recommendation, that's fine, but maybe start with Adam.
Going to Mars is hard. Landing on Mars, very hard. Staying on Mars, extremely hard. So I expect there to be failures, and I expect there to be phenomena that we haven't even imagined yet. Or who knows? We haven't tested any of this technology yet. So it's going to be interesting. I'm fully behind you. I think it's great what you're doing, and I wish you every success. Follow your dreams. Don't give up.
Great. Nick?
Well, I would like to wish Morgan good luck on her thesis defense tomorrow. And I'd also like to ask the final question of what the role would be. Oh, now I've just drawn a blank. I had it all formulated, so I'll have to let it go at that because I can't remember my question now.
I will do follow-up episode some other time then, maybe. Paul?
Yeah, well, I thank Morgan for being an outstanding guest and fielding all these questions from these old men and with grace and skill. And in 2 weeks, we'll have another podcast. I'll be hosting that one, I think, and I don't know who the guest will be, or probably won't be a guest to it. So if you're interested in being on the panel, let us know. And Sam, thank you very much for taking this on. And the last 2 episodes, you've gotten Morgan and her dad together, and we still don't know exactly what Deep Space Ecology is planning, but they won't tell us.
Excited to find out.
But I tell you what, if I had any influence, whatever, with any VCs, which I do not, I would encourage them to listen to what you guys are saying. So good, all the best to you.
I remembered my question. Do you see a role for further experiments like Biosphere 2 on Earth?
So I definitely see that we could utilize Biosphere 2, but we would definitely have to redo some things in the system. It's valuable. That system is valuable in regards to the ecological things that we've learned from it and the environmental science things that we've learned from it. But in regards to actually having its more space application, we would have to integrate it more into a realistic closed ecological system. I don't want to like offend anyone with that statement, but the way it currently is with 7 biomes in there, that's currently not really realistic for a space habitation analog.
Great.
It was well meant, but it wasn't practical.
Yeah, I'm glad that they did it because that really inspired me to look at the ecological side of things. But yeah, with practicality currently,
Awesome. Morgan, do you have any final remarks you want to share, or any upcoming events you want to mention before we sign off?
Well, I would like to thank you all for having me on as a guest. I've had a wonderful time. And since it's Earth Day weekend, I would just like to say that as we move forward into sending people into space, we should not forget about where we've come from. Because when we are up in space and looking down at Earth and experiencing this overview effect, we've come to realize that this is our home, and we need to be able to support it and be able to come back here after achieving the ability to live on Mars as well, and just be environmental stewards in that way, and be able to support our home here on Earth and any other home that we create out in our solar system.
Great. Well, thanks again to Morgan for being a guest panelist tonight, and thanks again to Lee Irons for the previous episode. This has been episode 72 of the Unseen Podcast. You can always find out more about the podcast at unseenpodcast.com. You can find back episodes, etc. Thanks again. Good night.
Bye.
Good.